What's up, guys? This is Jason Senti for BlueFirePoker.com. Today I'm going to do part 4 of my 2-4 No Limit 6-Max series here on Full Tilt. The more I think about it, the more likely I think it'll be that I will make this a 3-parter. We'll see. It depends on how far we get in the footage today. It's possible we'll fly right through. I did pay attention to the comments and all that stuff, as always. Thanks for the feedback, guys. Always appreciated. Even when it's negative, I obviously really like positive feedback. Makes me feel good about myself. But the negative stuff, I'll do my best as well. So first of all, I'll try and take a little less time on pre-flop, as per one request, and I'll do my best to explain any things that you guys want me to discuss further based on my comments. And here in the video, I there were a few questions last time that actually were pre-flop in the comments, and I commented on them. But then I also got somebody saying spend less time on pre-flop. So I'm going to do my best to try and walk that fine line. Maybe spend a little less time on pre-flop, but be willing to answer questions in the forum if you guys have them. I'm going to dive right back in. I haven't watched this since I played it. I watched part 1, obviously, when I did the commentary, and I haven't seen this part since. So we will dive on in, and I assume we'll remember our reads as we go, and I do my best to usually show notes and everything. So I added, assume straightforward till proven otherwise with She's So Heavy. That really is more based on stats than anything. I actually just made a fold and didn't even get to see a showdown, but the little bit I've seen so far, it looks like pretty straightforward play. It's possible in that spot that it was an Ace-King 8 board, I believe, that I folded at the end of the last video after I 3-bet blind versus blind. C-bet flop got called, and I folded to a river bet. More or less, it's most likely that was an ace, maybe a king, although most kings don't bet the river. So I'm making assumptions that it was straightforward play. It's possible it was a hand like 7-8, suited or something like that, floated out of position and bluffed the river. I think it's relatively unlikely. I think that's a decent play, but relatively unlikely. So for now, just going to assume straightforward. I ended up making a loose-ish call in the big blind here, in the top left. It's not necessarily great, but as long as on occasion you are doing things like here, I'm gonna check raise this board. Basically, this board hits me pretty well. Hits my flatting range quite well. We have a player who's relatively loose, opening from middle position, half stack, likely not all that good. So this board hits my range well. They don't necessarily know that, but they're going to be c-betting a lot generally, or most players will. So on a board like this, I think I can make a small re-raise, and this works particularly well with this player's stack size. This re-raise size, player only has 4x what my total bet is behind. So this is kind of one of those spots where it really puts Zeta Poker in a spot where a lot of people will really look at this as like stack off or fold. Realistically, Zeta probably can float even with like 9-10, 10 jack, 8x, pocket nines, things like that, and either win at showdown if there's some marginal showdown value, check back, maybe fold some turns, or bluff later on if it's a draw that misses. But realistically, I find in general people who are playing half stacks don't necessarily consider all those options nearly as often somebody plays a full stack. So even though there is room for them to do it, I think this is a spot where a lot of people end up playing a jam or fold game. And even if they flat, they might flat sometimes, it's actually going to be a pretty strong hand reasonably often, like a king queen plus type hand or queen jack plus. And I'm not making this check raise to get Zeta to fold top pair. So I think it's a pretty good spot for me to do that. I decided to 4-bet in the bottom left. Really, this is just one of those, hey, I have a blocker type things. You'll notice that our player is playing a whopping 5% of hands, but on the stats we have. But that's only across 20 hands. 20 hands, obviously, is a tiny, tiny sample. It's not much to think about. I have been, at this point, my attempt to steal is 100%. Granted, once again, only 20 hands. It's probably, a couple occurrences in the cutoff and button. But I think, with the fact that I'm looking pretty aggro, this player looks pretty tight, and, it's quite reasonable. This player's decent, being that, this player has, almost 2x stack here behind. I think it's an okay spot to go ahead and put in a 4-bet. We've got the ace blocker, making it a little bit better. Expect him to be 3-betting wide. It also is worth noting that we started this hand about 130 big blinds deep, somewhere in that range, roughly. And that makes this a lot tougher spot for them. Basically, if they're paying attention to stack sizes, they shouldn't be 3-betting and stacking off nearly as wide, post flop and even pre flop. A lot of people will then adjust their three betting ranges, which they should, as you start to get deeper. Usually, what that ends up meaning is people will have more hands that they have to fold to a four bet in general, just because they can't necessarily stack off, three bet and stack off with ace queen. So some people might not even three bet it. If they do decide to three bet ace queen or something like that in this spot, it really just puts them in kind of a nasty position. So that was an accident there. Forget about that. And let's say play. So we won the hand in the top left. I don't recall what happens in the bottom left. I'm guessing I'm getting a fold. I think you get a fold pretty often in this spot. And we did get a fold. Looks like we do have some more hands to play. So, definitely take a mental note, if you're playing and you get in a spot where, you know, this player so far appears to be tight, but the first time 3-bet folded to a 4-bet. Also be noting to yourself that, hey, I 4-bet. Flop the world in the bottom right. I just flatted pre without going too much into pre-flop. You could 3-bet or you can flat. I actually like 3-betting a little more in this spot than most just because we're deeper. But I decided to flat this time. And on this flop, when I flop the absolute joint, I really think I should be raising here just to keep my ranges pretty balanced. This is one of these, hands that I'm just so happy with. Now, it's possible I don't raise, and the reason I would see myself maybe not raising would be purely because, I'd be looking at stack sizes. Being that we started the hand nearly 150 big blinds deep, I'm not necessarily fist pumping getting in a 9 high diamond draw. Granted, I have the open ender to go with it, but the times I'm up against, on occasion, be up against like ace 10 of diamonds, even just like ace king of diamonds, hands like that, I'm in pretty tough shape for a lot of blinds. If I had a more aggro dynamic, we had like a really big history here. This is a spot where I happily stack off for 150 big blinds against certain players, and really the reason for that is that if you are going to play really aggressively, the deeper you get, the fewer hands you're going to be willing to just, put your entire stack in with. And hands like big draws are hands that most of the time you have reasonable equity with. So you need to include as many value, quote unquote, or stacking off hands as you can. And including a lot of big draws is a good way to be able to do that so that you can be raising very often with air. I wouldn't be surprised if I just flatted here. Looking back at it, I think it is a raise. For some reason, I'm kind of remembering me flat, even though I appear to be raising. The bottom left, I flatted with ace jack to an early position open. It's ace jack off is kind of loose, especially when it's not the button, where you're not closing the action in the big blind. But I don't think it's anything that's that big of a deal if you have a post flop edge with position, and it appears zenith over small samples loose. Regarding the flop, 7-7-7 flop. I'm actually not doing that great against his range, if assuming he has a relatively tight under the gun opening range. But this is the kind of spot where I represent pocket pairs so well from flatting preflop that I think I need to peel. I mean, I just look like I have a pocket pair more often than I look like I have ace high, I think. At least I think people will assume that. So that being the case, I just don't feel like I'm getting double barrel here hardly at all. And pretty often I can actually get him off of an ace high. If I peel flop, checks, I can bet the turn or bet the river and usually get a fold, getting them off of a chop. Or maybe not even a chop, but a better ace high with like ace king or something. So I think it's a very good spot to call once, and unless you're up against some like really tricky player, you got to be folding turns. Unfortunately, I flatted here in the bottom right. Yeah, I just think since you have pretty limited, options on the amount of hands that you can really go bananas with when you're deep, I think I have to be raising, even though I'm not thrilled at 150 big blinds. Getting in a 9 high draw, I think it just has to be done. Especially being a blind versus blind situation. It's a spot where, in blind versus blind, there's usually a pretty aggro dynamic and there's a fair amount of flop raises and position, things like that, just because it's really tough to combat. In a vacuum, that's actually an argument for not raising because, you might think that Roach will stack off lighter against me in that spot, and I'm not really looking like trying to go out of my way to stack off. It's more, I'd like to put pressure on him, get a fold, and at least this is a hand I can call with if I do get played back at. But yeah, still, as part of your game plan, should be raising. And it's possible too that if Roach, gets a bit suspicious, and some players will do this, that I might get, we have room for me to raise flop and for him to three bet fold, which is just an amazing situation for us. If we can get him to put in a three bet on the flop and then fold with all that dead money, and we have nine high, I mean that's just a spot you want to put yourself in as often as possible. I actually just check back the turn after peeling the flop. Uh, I once again, I prefer I see myself bet. The four isn't the greatest card in the world for me to represent, but of course I will have. I mean, seriously, I'm going to have almost all my fours in my range. That also means my range is just really wide. There's no question. But I'm not folding hardly ever when small blind opens to my big blind. So, any case, I certainly can rep a four. Can get him off of other draws himself, which I may or may not be able to win against. With or without showdown, it's very reasonably likely that we'll end up checking the turn with some kind of reasonable draw, and then on the river bluffing something like that. So, any case, I should have bet the turn. Maybe get him off a seven or something, or continue, or set up a two barrel bluff to maybe try and get him off of pocket eights, pocket nine, something like that. It just gives me more options, and I just think I'm getting check raised almost never. So, may as well be doing it. Now that it's played out the way it has, boy, it's pretty close. It looks like I checked. I I mean, there's a lot of draws on the flop, and most of them missed. Ace nine or eight nine missed. All the gutters that are in there as well, like the jack eights of the world, and so did diamonds. Of course, 5-6 got there. I think it's probably worth betting, just not very big. Maybe betting like 70, trying to represent a weakish 10 or a 7 or a hand like pocket 8, something like that. Just trying to get thin value. It's a little bit transparent, but the times that Roach has ace high and likely would just fold to a river bet. This is me not necessarily giving Roach a ton of credit. For all I know, Roach is really good. I just don't know that for sure. But if we're going to fold like an ace high or like a king queen type hand, some percentage of the time it's probably a worthwhile bet if we bet about half pot. I still expect top pair type hands to call me, and good players sometimes will be calling with ace high as well. But until it's proven to me that they're a really really good hand reader, I think this is a profitable bluff. So all around, I would not have gotten that hand to fold, of course. But to be perfectly honest, it looks like by my review, I would change the way I played that hand on every single street. The possible exception of preflop. I don't think preflop's that big of a deal. So it's not always thrilling to look back at hands when you're doing a video and be like, "Ugh, I don't like the way I played any of this." But uh, it is what it is. There's no way we play hands. I mean, obviously nobody ever plays perfect poker. There's no question about it. I don't even know how you could really. I mean, the way to define perfect poker would basically be if you made the best possible decision every time as if you knew their hole cards. And a lot of people, even knowing their hole cards, wouldn't always make the best decisions. I'm sure I wouldn't in every spot. There's room for creativity and things. Ideas that you could do something very, a little bit differently than expected. Secondly, unfortunately, we don't even play as well, our 100% A game or A plus game all the time. And so, that's a spot where even by, I don't think I've gotten any better at No Limit Hold'em since I reviewed that hand, but I just didn't play it as well as I think I could have. Easy 3-bet with pocket queens here. As you can see, I have been 3-betting a fair amount in the bottom right. I'm at 15.4%, and I am pretty sure that I've actually 3-bet Toilet Mummy once. So Toilet Mummy, basically click it back 4 bets. It's 2x. It's an easy jam. We're pretty happy about it. Obviously, sometimes we will be beat, but that will be less often than we will be getting folds plus up or against a range or against the range of hands within his 4-bet calling range that we beat / crush. Pretty often when we get called here, we're up against ace king, but we're also going to be up against like pocket tens, pocket jacks, stuff like that. Against some players, nines and eights, etc. ace queen. And then, of course, we get spots like that where they fold. So just because we're deep, I decided to 3-bet ace-10 offsuit in position here. I actually don't have Roach folding to any 3-bets, which makes choosing a hand like ace-10 off all that much better to do it with. Basically, I should be a little bit more likely to kind of merge my 3-betting range and just have more, basically do it with a wider value range as opposed to a bunch of air. Now, granted, I think we have 28 hands on the guy, so it's not that big of a deal. But pretty much this deep, it's hard to be wrong 3-betting almost anything in position. Of course, that changes quite a bit if when you have like players in the blinds you really want to have come along, things like that. But and we got to fold. We've already got the one kind of goofy history with him where, if I remember correctly, and it looks like I might pull up the notes, maybe not. Worth noting, we had this hand where we 3-bet him in position, I think with like ace-4 off or something, and excuse me, he called out of position and check min raised something like, I don't remember the exact spot, but like let's just say it was like ace-3 deuce. I know it was, he had two tens, pocket tens, and the tens were in between an ace and the other two cards. And he checked min raised the flop, and then we checked it down. So it's the type of player that we're going to have to expect to do kind of, silly-ish little raises and things like that with hands that have some value. There's some merit to some of it. It's basically putting more of a semi-bluff, more semi-bluffs into your range when you are check raising with hands that, really are hands that are going to be very difficult to check call down and to see a showdown. So there's definitely some merit to some of that. I think doing with two tens on that board isn't all that good, but maybe doing it in a spot of like a Jack 9 4 board with 4-5, I think is actually pretty reasonable. Open Jack 7 diamonds in the cutoff, get flat in the big blind by our buddy Roach, and flop the world again, relatively speaking. Bet for sure. The second barrel, I think, really is necessary. We just have a ton of equity, and against almost anything. And really, this is like the kind of hand that we don't mind getting the occasional folds, being that we only have second pair. But there also is, can be some value, which is a little bit more important from hands like a 9-10 of diamonds or just 9-10. We can prevent a lot of those hands from realizing their equity, and if not, we can get value. So, and we get check min raised. Woohoo! Not exactly a thrilling spot. Wow, I think it looks like I might raise, which is kind of bananas. But not necessarily terrible. So basically, the standard here would certainly be to flat and make some river decisions against this guy as well, who we have a reason to believe does this with kind of in-between type hands. It may seem like there's even more merit to just flatting. I still, even though it looks like I'm raising, I'm still guessing I flatted, just because this guy is more likely to be doing this with like 4-5 and 7-9, stuff like that, hands that we beat. So it's not that big of a deal. Also hands that are just going to check rivers anyway, and we'll get to show down. One thing is, though, is like if we really knew that this player was only doing it with hands like that, and this was like a flop situation, I actually would prefer to see myself 3-bet. And the reason for that is not only, granted we're beating, him a decent amount, but sometimes he's going to have a hand like 8-9. And hands like that are just going to fold. They're just going to have to. Now, in this spot, I don't necessarily advocate a raise, and, the more I think about it. And that's just because, this is the turn. A lot of people really just don't raise anything except really nutted hands on the turn. As poker progresses and time goes on, that's been changing quite a bit. People are starting to realize just how unbalanced they are with turn raises and starting to do it with draws and things like that. And some like marginal made hands that they don't feel they can continue on the turn that maybe they check called the flop with. But I don't necessarily know that about him, and I think I just have to give him credit for a pretty strong range. Make a flat and play a river. Oh, okay, so it looked like I was just going up to click timer. Interesting river. So 06 hits. It's a bit of a goofy spot. Basically, we're gonna win when we check back sometimes, which this really is a spot where I would say we probably do have showdown value, just because of what I've seen him check raise flops with. Granted, was a turn, etc. But I think as of right now, we have to assume sometimes we're gonna win when we check back. Which I guess makes me more prone to check back. Spot where I really think people should be considering overbet jamming. It seems a little crazy. There certainly are fives in our range, though. There's no question about it. 5-7, yeah, 5-7. I guess 5-6 would have, we obviously would have the nuts, and we're not opening. I guess we're opening. It's from the cutoff effectively. So yeah, there's a ton of fives in our range, 5-4, etc., etc. So it's somewhat reasonable, and I just think you're going to get a ton of folds. Granted, it's not the greatest price in the world. Just something, make sure you're keeping options like that in mind and consider them at any given moment. As is, I think we probably should check back with what we know about them, and I still expect to lose most of the time. And it was 10-8. So wow, this guy, be honest, it worked on us, I guess. It got us to quit barreling. But this is the kind of spot, it really is the exact same mentality as those flop situations. Just now, like, he check calls the flop, just calls, when he has top pair. But we know he raises with, like, second pair type stuff. And then on the turn, when his top pair turns into second pair, he min raises us. And, I don't necessarily think it's one of those, like, free showdown raises and he's thought this through. I think most likely what's going on is this is the kind of guy who's like, he just doesn't really know what to do when he has a second pair type hand. Doesn't really want to call, doesn't want to fold because he's got something, so he just raises. And there's probably not a heck of a lot more thought behind it than that. I would 100% tag this guy as a fish right now until proven otherwise. There's definitely a way for it to be a reasonable game plan to be doing stuff like that. And it would at least be unique and people might not react well to it. But it's just so rare that it's people doing that kind of thing. It's far more likely this guy is just pretty fishy and doesn't know what to do, so he just spaz raises. Good information. Knowing that, that's the kind of spot now where it's like it really, really adds even more justification to the idea of one, maybe shoving the river. But two, even more importantly, is that 3-bet on the turn. Like I said, if we really knew he was doing stuff like this on the turn, with hands like that, even if he is doing it with, his value hands too, which he likely is like, value hands he's going to stack off with, not as necessarily top pair, but two pairs, sets, things like that. Well, that's not that bad. We're going to have some equity at least with a flush draw, maybe some two pair outs, and realistically, if he's doing it every damn time he has second pair, and then doing it most of the time he has monsters. Well, second pair type hands come around so much more often. We're just going to get so many folds with a lot of money in the middle. Knowing what I know now, 100% believe we should be 3-balling the turn and getting it in. A minor rant on that thought process. So you'll have noticed in the hand, as I was talking about it, I was like, oh, geez, what is this? Like taking a few minutes and like really having to think through what do most people do this kind of stuff with. This is tripping me up a little bit. So props to him on that. But what you have to do, if you're continuing, is what I just did afterwards. Is okay, we got to see a showdown. We got one more piece of information about a guy that like you very easily could just like roll your eyes, move on, and be like, okay, whatever, weirdo check min raised me. He's lucky I didn't get there, and he's an idiot, something like that. What you should really be doing is taking the next step and being like, okay, now that I know what I know, how can I exploit that? How can I take advantage of that? And that's a pretty big exploit on the turn if he's doing stuff like this, and now all of a sudden we're getting a bunch of folds with $266 in the middle. Like, over half a buy-in, and we can get the rest in with draws pretty often. I mean, having an ace high flush draw with no pair here, something like ace king of diamonds, is pretty similar type thing to our jack seven of diamonds. And like we can sometimes just like take down this pot with ace high when there's a ton of money in the middle because he's opening himself up to things like this. I mean, it just shows like a very it's very likely that this guy has, a big weakness in his turn game and just his check small raise game in general, where he adds and like puts in extra money in unnecessary spots and opens himself up to being fully exploited and losing hands that he's already put a good amount of money into because he can't call a shove. So a little bit of a tangent. I just on occasion like to point out why things are bad. So often I just hear people in videos and on forums, etc., just say things like, "Oh, obviously that's LOL bad." It's like, well, is it necessarily obvious? I remember a long time ago when I was playing cards and learning and trying to come up. Sometimes I would do the same thing and go with it kind of, or think the same. Like, yeah, I guess that is haha, that is bad because I know nobody else does it. But I didn't necessarily understand why it was bad. And I think the day I really started trying to figure that stuff out and really put a lot of time into figuring out why certain leaks or certain things are bad, how I can exploit them. I think that was like a big turnaround day for my poker career and my poker development. End rant. I raised check back flop with bottom pair here. Raised when I hit trips against a weaker player or assumed weaker player. No big deal. Check back second pair. Gonna make the call on the top right. It's actually kind of a goofy spot. You don't see a lot of flatting from the small blind when you open the button. Ranges sometimes are a little bit tougher. What's reasonably likely is, there might be some ace-x suited type hands. A lot of people are going to be three betting those. Some, medium-ish pocket pairs, sevens, eights, things like that. And then occasionally, some other suited type hands. Really considering a pre-flop range up here in the top right, I'm having a hard time right now figuring out what he has. King Queen is certainly reasonable, but I don't necessarily know if King Queen would bet the turn. When he checks a river, I think I have to check behind it, and I actually expect to win pretty often, even though that seems a little weird. I feel like that was kind of a bluff pretty often, and it was Ace Jack offsuit. I guess we didn't win, but I think that's a somewhat strange way to play that hand pre-flop. Fortunately, we get squeezed when we've got ducks in the top left. The deuceors. Oh, now it's a really easy fold. You're going to see that I'm going to put another note on Roach. Bottom right. Basically, I'm writing, hey, check it out. He did the same thing on the turn. And, another major thing worth mentioning is that he didn't do it on the flop. Just one more sign that his range when he does that kind of stuff is pretty weak because he's not doing it with top pair medium kicker. I'm not saying, in a vacuum by any means top pair medium kicker should be a check raise all the time. But if you're doing this crap all the time, like check raising every time you have second pair, yeah, you probably are going to have to start including a lot of value hands. I definitely could have 3-bet him again with Queen 10 off in the bottom right. I like it a little better when I'm deeper. Really, the reason you start doing that at that point is to just, really start leaning on the guy and, seeing how he reacts. Just take people out of their comfort zone. I don't necessarily think that's always the case, what you need to be doing, especially because a lot of people are, if they're making pretty big mistakes already, you don't necessarily want to make them aware to it, like if he's playing really badly in 3-bet pots, folding too often, things like that. But, if they're playing somewhat reasonable, it's not bad to just try and change things a lot for them and see how they react, especially against weaker players. So here, let's take a look to see what I'm looking at in these stats. Hit play and then pause when I got the pop-up. Okay, so he is 3-bet. From the blinds, it looks like he's got pretty small 3-bet percentages at this point. Full to 4-bet, let's see if I move my mouse cursor, is actually at 60%, pretty high, but it's only a sample of five, and I already have a little bit of a four bet dynamic. He already four bet me once, and I shoved over it, and he folded. So I think going either way here is okay. Um, Looking purely at the stats, I think you're better off calling with a hand so strong like aces, getting a C bet out of this guy because we did see these C bets quite a bit, at least 2/3 of the time, probably higher in three bet pots. Getting the C bet out of him and then getting the money in on the flop, which is a pretty nice situation, and I think that's fine. If you decided though to in this spot four bet, the main reasoning for it, besides of course a little bit of range balancing stuff, but taking a combo of aces out of that isn't that big of a deal. Um, the biggest reason is just because we kind of have a little bit of this four betting dynamic going on so far, and so far I look like I don't fold. He four bet me, I shoved. He had to fold. So it's a kind of spot where we've already established it, and I already look aggro. So if I four ball him, maybe he'll shove something he shouldn't. So I'm okay with either decision here. It's one of those things where it's kind of difficult to misplay aces, and it's just a great spot, 100 big blinds deep with an aggro dynamic. And on this flop, if you see bets, I think there's no question it's a good spot for a smallish raise, and hope to see him jam. Basically, we're trying to rep air type hands that are looking to get a fold, and then of course sometimes there'll be jack nines, king jacks, stuff like that. More likely king jack for me, because then you have an overcard as well. Really strange that he click it back. Three bets on the flop. It's like, I mean, gosh, this looks like complete stone cold air, and he just doesn't believe me because I see Magro, or the nuts, nuts, nuts. Like three queens. I'm pretty sure I remember that he had neither of those hands. Pretty sure he actually had pocket jacks, which is a pretty strange way to play this. Not necessarily bad. If he is going to stack off with jacks here, at least when he does it this way with this baby three bet, he gives me a chance to shove a little more air. Also balancing whenever he wants to bluff in a very small amount, but it's just not something you see that often. Either way, it doesn't matter. It's not like I'm ever considering folding there, so getting it in. He does turn an open ender for some more outs, but didn't get it that time. Actually, don't really sit and dwell all that often on previous poker hands, but seeing that there where he had an open ender with Broadway stuff along with setouts on a Broadway tape board actually made me think uh, immediately about my exit from the main event this year. It was a very similar spot. In reality, he only that situation. Chong only had half the open ender because the other half gave me a full house. But obviously, money was a coin flip when it went in. I had my fair share of suckouts. I'm not complaining. It's just I had like a little bit of a nostalgia moment right there, just seeing that, being like, oh, I would prefer to have lost that one. Doesn't really work that way though. During this killing time thing, I'll say that I know like a lot of people have talked about Chung blowing up or whatever in the main event. I think Joe Chung's a really good poker player, really good tournament player, and I still haven't actually watched the hand, so I should watch it. But I would say that I'm not intentionally trying to be cryptic. This is an educational video, but I don't have, I haven't fully watched the hand and stuff. But on paper, hearing what he did when he I don't know what it was, 6 or 7 bet jammed ace 7. From with the little bit I thought about it right after I heard about it, I actually didn't necessarily think it sounded all that bad from the dynamic I knew about at the table. It's a little bonus extra there, I guess, whether or not you wanted it or not. So I 3-bet 7-8 offsuit in the bottom left in position. It's not an amazing spot, but Zenith appears to be a weaker player, as we've already mentioned, opening a lot of hands, just thought there's a good chance I'm going to get some folds. On the flop, I actually, this deep, very, very much prefer betting as opposed to checking back. The reason is we had so much behind still, or a good amount behind still, that I don't think we're getting check raised off the best hand very often. The only times it happens, it's like a 10 jack of hearts or something, and it's not that big of a deal because he'll have great equity. And this allows us to represent more hands, represent all king X's that we'd 3-bet, represent the 9-8 type stuff, the big heart draw with ace queen of hearts, that kind of stuff, and it just allows us to set up a barrel, along with just getting some folding and playing less of a guessing game. Because when we check back, we rarely have that strong of a hand, and so we're going to see a fair amount of bets and we'll have to make decisions on it. So turns a 5, giving us a gutter. And now we have to definitely sit here and look at stack sizes. This is a spot now where it's a pretty reasonable stack size now for him to check raise all in. Sorry, it looks like I'm taking notes on Toilet Mummy here. I don't like that I timed down a bunch now. So basically, it's a reasonable stack size for him to check raise all in for sure. But I really don't mind barreling here, having picked up a little extra equity. I think we're going to get folds sometimes from like 9x's, 8x's, 10s, jacks, and I think hands like that make up a really big portion of his range. I don't expect a king to fold, but I don't necessarily expect it to check raise either. So, considering the fact that there's just not going to be that many hands he's check jamming on us, I don't think we're going to be losing our equity all that often. That is, a big part of the fear of betting in a spot like this is losing your equity, because we have, most likely our two pairs are good, most likely our our trip outs are good, most likely our, pretty much always our straight outs are good. So, or, they're always good for at least half the pot. So, any case, it's the kind of thing where you have to concern yourself a little bit with that. But fact of the matter is one, when we do get check jammed on, the range it's going to check jam on us here on the turn against, a player who's likely a little bit weaker. Our two pair outs and trip outs probably aren't good against that anyway, or at least they're heavily, heavily discounted. So we're not really losing that much equity. We're basically losing the equity of a gutter. So I don't think it's that big of a deal. And two, there's more hands that are second pair type hands that are going to fold a decent percentage of the time. Quite a bit more than there are hands that are stacking off. So I prefer I bet. After I've timed down for quite a while, I actually don't mind checking, because it really does look like I had to consider it, and I don't like that all that often. I do my best to balance things like this at higher stakes, so that it's not an issue when I actually do have to think. But I haven't been in like this session, so I don't hate that I checked here after I already did that, but I would prefer to have bet. And I definitely think betting is the better play. I have very little information here. I just got to fold. The jack's a bad card. If the card were, even just an offsuit deuce, I probably could call. A jack, maybe, I guess. It really depends on how good of a hand reader they are. The thing is with a jack now, a lot of his draws picked up a pair, and they may check with those. So that will take some of his air out of this betting range. Good players can actually even value bet a jack here quite often, because I'm pretty much always betting twice with any decent king, and I did 3-bet pre-flop, so most of my kings will be pretty good ones. It's a spot where I probably have to fold now, and I'm not happy about it. 6-7 even got there on the turn. So really, all we beat here is hearts. Yeah, I hope I don't see myself do something silly. 7-10 got there. It all got there. So. Looks like we're picking up a few hands here. I'm just going to fold to a c-bet from what a sick call here in the bottom left. Occasionally doing some things like raising this flop, with what really is a very, very low out semi bluff is okay. And actually should be doing that kind of stuff on occasion, but this is not that big of a deal. And to be honest, a board like that hits my flatting range pretty well. So obviously there's room to do things like that, but it also means I'm not just like folding all the time on that board. And more than anything, I've been active recently. So here is actually one of those spots where I'm going to raise with a bottom pair type hand. Highly coordinated board. I really can't flat in the top left. Hits my flatting range really, really well. And we have over 100 big blinds. So once again, this is a spot where I can just put some pressure on him. Expect to get called pretty often by like king queen type hands. It's his best case. Expect him to stack off with some big draws, jack queen type stuff and sets. The rest though, I guess like king jack of clubs, but really that's a big draw type hand. A lot of the rest of his range just has to fold here, and he is going to have a ton of pocket pairs that he opened, the ace kings, the ace tens, all that kind of stuff. Occasionally some 9-10 type stuff or 10 kings suited that, really this is a pretty tough spot for them. Especially, both of them are almost effectively the same hand. So, in any case, I think I'm going to get a fair amount of folds, and even if I don't here, I actually can bluff on a lot of turn cards because I would expect his flatting range to be made up quite a bit of top pair type stuff. Sometimes it's going to be draws and then we get check raise, but that's not that big of a deal because we don't have much. And flatting certainly isn't a great option unless it's with the intention of bluffing pretty often later. So, being that we're a little over 100 big blinds deep, I like that raise. You can put them in a tough spot. 3-betting ace queen suited out of the big blind. If I did get 4-bet, and it is something to consider, I'd look at the information I have on this guy. I do at least have 150 hands on this guy. And it's pretty easy to determine whether or not I can stack off comfortably with ace queen here. But pretty often I'm going to get, flats or folds. And we got a fold in the top left. Three betting to a little less than pot in the top left, and obviously hoping I'm able to find a way to get it in. We got called. So this is the kind of board that actually hits his range all right, but I still think you should just be betting. Unless somebody's just always like calling just tons with mid Broadway type hands and stacks off super duper light, and it's going to put yourself in tough spots. I think you should be betting. If you are going to be checking back against people like that, in order to combat it, you better start checking back some stronger hands than this as well, or they can exploit the living hell out of you. So, any case, I think just on a Jack 9-3 flop, is the pre-flop 3-better. It's pretty standard. C-bet. Continue from there. We do have 2 overcards as well, so getting called isn't like all that big of a deal. But the biggest thing is it should be profitable, just as like one street vacuum. We're just going to get folds more than often enough for the price we are laying ourselves with our bet. I think I just saw myself fold 9-7 suited. I'm rewinding here. Yeah, I decided to fold 9-7 suited in the small blind versus a button open. And I think my reasoning for it was that, I know I've done a fair amount of 3-betting on this table. What a sick call. Seems like, a decent regular. Still, I'm seeing a pretty high fold to 3-bet percentage over a sample that is approaching 100 hands. I'm seeing it at 100. I'd prefer to see myself 3-bet it. Obviously not a big deal. I'm not going to take a ton of time on a pre-flop situation, as I was asked not to. But I think I can get away with 3-betting it there. It plays pretty well post-flop. We're not all that deep, so it's not going to be like some really nasty out of position spot all that often. Just fold to the 3-bet in the top right. Bottom right, it's a standard check back. It's okay to bet on the flop because we, might be getting called by Jack Queen type stuff, weaker tens pretty often. But in general, I have to feel like somebody's peeling the flop a lot before I want to do that. Until proven that, I'm just gonna check back, play pretty standard. There's no question I'm not gonna fold this turn. Realistically, I'm not that thrilled. Jack clubs is a pretty bad turn for me. Now those Jack Queen type hands have a pair, and even makes a few other hands as well, but still gonna call and play a river. We did pick up a gutter. And we bink. It's actually the kind of spot where the ace of clubs, I know this is far more of a PLO concept, but that ace of club blocker is actually a little bit relevant considering the fact that we have like 10 times pot left behind almost here to start the river. So it's a spot where if I do get check raised, I'm actually, have room and the possibility of turning my hand into a bluff to get him off of weaker clubs. I'm not saying I'm going to do that all the time, but something worth considering. We get a fold, which we expected to get most of the time. It's an interesting thing to note against players that you have, a decent history with, or at least that are very aggro and like high intensity, as Phil calls them. Just people who are thinking really hard about a lot of situations. Because good players in that spot might actually check raise you pretty big, trying to get you off a chop pretty often. They'll expect you to fold your air. They'll get you, okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to say when they have like an ace. There's 4 to a straight, just an ace. Yeah, they know you'll fold your air, and then they know, and then they expect you to fold your aces a chunk of the time when they check raise, especially if they do it a reasonable size, just because it's a spot where you definitely could be facing a flush, and then they can get you off a chop. So if I'm up against players like that, it's actually a nice little side benefit to have that ace of clubs. It gives me a little more incentive to go ahead and shove and rebluff. Now, to be perfectly honest, if you're in a dynamic like that, that that kind of thing is happening, and they know that it's going to be a spot where then there's less value in it if they know that they're doing that, simply because now they can pretty comfortably, check raise, call 3-bet jam with any flush because that dynamic's going. But early on, it's a spot they might not expect you to ever be doing that with a straight or air. So you might actually get a fair amount of folds. But you really kind of have to be one level ahead of your opponent in that spot to make that work. But it is the kind of thing that I think there could be value in on occasion. Flop went check check, top right. And I expect to be good pretty often on the turn. Now that he called the turn bet, I think that he has some king X's, like king queen type hands. So those hands will check the flop quite often, and then pick a pair on the turn. And then the ace X hands that I'm chopping with, basically all of them except ace king. Now with this specific 10 river, it's pretty bad for me because ace king, king queen, even like, I guess king 10 doesn't matter. You wouldn't have it because he'd raise turn. But a number of those hands now, have pretty close to nutted up. And I'm, of course, never getting a fold. If it were a spot where it wasn't a 10, it's actually worth considering overbetting to like 1.5x pot or something to get him off of a chop the times he has ace X. And, the king queen type hands are probably folding anyway in that spot, so it's not that big of a deal. But you can, get half the pot from him pretty often. On the 10, though, I think that's a bad decision. And I actually think I should check fold. So we get a pretty big squeeze. The top left. Looks like I check squeeze stats, etc. I don't think we have enough hands to do anything crazy. Well, maybe it's semi-reasonable. I think more likely though, it's a spot where we're going to want to flat. If I knew a guy was pretty nuts, it's not a bad hand to just jam with. There's a lot of dead money already in the middle. And we flop the effective nuts. Grip knife folds. This is a snap call, even though I'm pretty sure, yeah, you're up against the nizzles, the actual nizzles. Rollify, obviously, pretty bad play. To be putting in that much of effective stacks pre-flop with 7-9 hearts, but in the small blind, likely a pretty weak player. It doesn't matter. We nut up on the turn. Actually, it looks like that might be a pretty good spot to end it. We'll finish a couple of these hands here. Yeah, I can talk about this top right hand. So, rewind it. Pretty sure I remember this correctly. Pretty sure I raised out of the small blind. I doubt I limp called. Okay. So we're going to look at the top right really quick and call this a video. So I raised from the small blind. U17 makes the call on the big. And in this spot here, I just had to take a slightly non-conventional line for a bluff, and that is to check call the flop. I actually expect pretty often for this flop to go check, and then I'll get folds on turns. Most good players just don't expect you to check on a flop like this ever with air, or at least decent hand readers, unless they, of course, have some history and know you are tricky, etc. So when you check, a lot of times people will just check back most of their stuff, even air-type hands, just knowing they're not going to get folds that often. But if he does bet, I think check calling represents an ace really, really well here. I'm not representing a 7 this way, but I'm not necessarily going for that. There's just far more ace-x hands in my range. So the plan then is to, have the turn go check, and then bluff the river. But in this spot, I actually pick up second pair. So when he checks back the turn, I actually think I'm good a ton. Sometimes I'm losing to other second pair type hands. So like 10 jacks and stuff. Now I'm chopping with those. It's not even that bad. I'm pretty sure I check here, showdown win. I think I should bet. I don't think I'm not really going to be picking off bluffs, especially on that queen. I just probably can't even really call a river bet. So I think that by betting, I do a couple things. One, I can maybe get him off some chops when he picked up a 10, because I represent ace-x way, 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 way better than I represent a 10 or anything else. And two, I get to protect a little bit of information. I just think I'm getting a fold a ton. And this is the kind of thing that, if I'm playing a lot with somebody, I prefer not to have them see me just straight take a really, really goofy, kind of tricky line on them. I just prefer they not see that I'm doing this here. Not that I think it's worth like tons and tons, and it's like this crazy valuable thing. But it shows that I'm tricky in thinking about it. And he did have Jack 10. I would have gotten him off a chop. So, okay, it's been 53 minutes. Better call it a video. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Leave me questions, all that stuff. As always, this is Jason Senti for BlueFirePoker.com. Thanks for watching, guys.